I'm Dalton Dale, a music enthusiast on a mission to learn about my favorite genre, heavy metal. Join me as I listen through and learn about the history of heavy metal music. We'll be talking about bands, albums, songs, and historical events that helped create the metal music genre as we know it today. This is the Hevolution Podcast. Hey everyone, what's going on? Welcome to the Evolution Podcast. I am your host, Dalton Dale. I'm excited to be here with you today and working from some new gear. It's been a lot of fun to play around with, and I'm just getting used to it. So I hope you're going to enjoy the improved quality of things moving forward. I posted an unboxing video. I know some gearheads and people just like to watch new things get opened and checked out. It's super exciting for me. So head on over to my YouTube channel and check that out. You can just find that Evolution Podcast on YouTube and you'll be able to find that. So, uh, we're going to just jump right in here. As for those of you that have been following along, right now we are churning through the rise of power metal in the early 80s, and this particular style of metal was an evolution of heavy metal that it blended musical elements of new wave of British heavy metal, such as dueling guitar parts, and combine that with early American heavy metal. So, like increased guitar distortion and some sounds that came out of punk rock from the late 70s. So, lots of speed and more driving rhythms from the drums and bass. And this shifted sort of the lyrical content from the standards of the time, which were more sex, drugs, and rock and roll lifestyle, to a more mystical and fantastical elements, such as fictional beasts, magical characters and settings, and Satan and the occult, as we discussed on last week's album from Merciful Fate. Power metal was the precursor to thrash and speed metal, and the bands that I've covered through this period, except Anthrax, Warlock, Metallica, Merciful Fate, those were all critical to establishing sounds and styles that carried on in various ways over time, with new bands entering heavy metal for the first time, and some of those bands becoming the face of heavy metal on a grand scale. It's often talked about the big four, with Anthrax, Metallica, Slayer, and Megadeth being the four sort of primary bands that came out on a large scale, and that most other bands sort of branched out from. And, as I've gone through and I'm listening to all of this, I would have to argue that really makes sense. I mean, I think that right now, as I've said in a few of my previous episodes, power metal is this sort of diverging point for what I think stylistically becomes most of the more modern heavy metal. There are certain bands that like to carry on some of the sounds that new wave of British heavy metal brought, the sounds that, your bands like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden and Motorhead and Def Leppard, all of those guys that they sort of set out to create that new sound and style for the time. There are some bands that carry that on, but I think that most bands are nowadays are more derivative of bands like Metallica and Megadeth and Anthrax and Slayer in some capacity. Whether that's Metallica and their speed and extremely guitar focused music, to Megadeth with that more heavier thrash style of music, or Anthrax with a little bit more antic style performance and heavier, more extreme type vocals, to Slayer in the more black metal and really dark and heavy and definitely extreme type vocals. I think any of those four bands really lend to the long-term growth and development of heavy metal as a genre, and it's easy to see why those have become the foundation. And all of those bands were born out of this period of power metal in the early 80s. So it's again, it's become increasingly apparent why there's so much that happens during this time, and I think that it's just a really critical time period for heavy metal as a whole. And I think that most of what we listen to today, if you're a modern metalhead like myself, I think most of what we listen to today wouldn't exist if it wasn't for bands that I've covered in and through this power metal era, and even today's band that we'll be covering. So, really, I've really enjoyed going through this period because I'm really starting to feel the evolution of the sound. I'm really starting to feel how we got from Black Sabbath to Bring Me the Horizon, or um, Lorna Shore, or Norma Jean, or In Flames, even like your Linkin Parks and your Slipknots. I mean, any of those bands, I'm starting to kind of feel a little bit more how we got from where we started into what we have now. And early on, that was a little bit difficult for me, but I think that's largely just because when you go back and you listen to something like the first Black Sabbath album, or even their follow-up, Paranoid, I think that those albums, they have their own sound, they have their own style, and for me, those still hold a pretty special place for me. It was kind of the beginning of this journey, but stylistically, I think it's been some of the music that I've been I've related most to, but early on it was hard to really feel how did we get from there to where we are now. Now, as I've listened to more, and I've got more of a catalog underneath me of bands that I've listened to, and albums that I've listened to that were integral to the various periods of heavy metal that we've covered so far, it's been a lot easier for me to see how we're going to continue to evolve and how we get there. And so I'm looking forward to just continuing to grow along and go through this journey. I think that there are, going to be some really tremendous opportunities to learn as we go through thrash metal and black metal. I think that those are going to be two really key pieces to setting up death metal, and then ultimately, we're going to get into the hardcore scene, and we'll go through all different kinds of, uh, you know, genres as we go. A buddy of mine asked me the other day, "Hey, are you going to get to like Slipknot and some of those?" And I fully intend to. I fully intend to really carry this from the very beginning and address this all the way up through modern times. And I don't know how long that's going to take me, and I hope you'll continue down the journey for me, because I'm even really looking forward to learning about the bands that, inspired the bands that I listen to today, and I hope to interview some of those bands like we did a few weeks ago and talk to them about who inspired them to start making the music that they make now. And so, just kind of a little glimpse into the future and what my plans are. But when we say the Evolution podcast, I mean this is the evolution of heavy metal through all of time, and I plan to just keep this thing going. And as I get further down, who knows how long it'll be, but as I get further down into bands that I grew up with and that bands that I'm most familiar with, I hope to even lend a little bit more knowledge and more credibility to some of that, because those are things that I experienced firsthand. I didn't grow up in the 80s, so this is all brand new for me, and I'm relying on the internet, I'm relying on interviews and those kinds of resources to carry me through this. The book that I'm reading, Sound of the Beast, I'm relying on that kind of information to really carry me through this, and then as well just picking things up as I listen to these albums. So it's been good. So that brings us to this week's band. It's called Exciter. We're going to be talking their second album, Violence and Force. It's been a good listen. There's a few noteworthy moments on the album, and I'm excited to share those with you. So we're going to take a quick break, and I'll be right back. Hey everyone, just wanted to take a quick moment and just remind you about the Evolution podcast playlist that I've got on Spotify. I've mentioned this in a few episodes before, but I just want to give a fresh reminder for any new listeners out there. If you head over to Spotify, you can just search for my personal profile, Dalton A. Dale, and I've got a customized playlist called the Evolution podcast playlist, and it is filled with everything that I listen to for this podcast. It goes all the way back to when I started this out as just a TikTok page and runs it all the way through to this week's episode. So be sure to go check that out. You can follow it there. Again, just find my personal profile, Dalton A. Dale, and find my playlist, the Evolution Podcast playlist, and you can follow along. We will get you right back to the episode. All right, quick hit number one. Now, the band is named after a Judas Priest song of the same title. They were originally named Hellraiser when they first formed, and they changed their name around 1978 or 79. I thought this was interesting. Those of you that have been following and listening for a while, I actually interviewed a friend of mine's son, Jensen, a while back, who is doing his own solo music, and he started out under the name Hellraiser. So that caught my attention. He's since changed his name to Toxic. So go check it out on YouTube. He's working through some like extreme thrash death metal type music. And honestly, I think I think he just picked up the guitar like 2.5, 3 years ago, and the kid can shred. So go check it out if you have a chance. You can find it on YouTube. But Toxic is what you're looking for. So, anyways, Exciter, they started out as Hellraiser. Now, the song Exciter was featured on the album Stained Class. It's an album I haven't listened to by Judas Priest, but I did go listen to that song, and it is easily one of the fastest songs by Priest that I've ever heard. So it's filled with double bass on the drums, and there's a very speedy sort of it's like dan 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 guitar riff. So it's pretty easy to see how Exciter the band would be inspired by this song to name their band from. All right, quick hit number two. After releasing their first record titled Heavy Metal Maniac, I'll talk about that in a moment, they signed a deal with the late Johnny Zazula, the mastermind behind Megaforce Records and Metallica's Kill 'Em All, Merciful Fate's Melissa, and Anthrax's Fistful of Metal. Now, that's just a few. I even remembered that Raven All for One, an album that we covered not long ago, was also a Johnny Z Megaforce album. And really, I think that the entirety of modern metal owes a great deal of debt and gratitude to Johnny Z for his early discoveries and the risks that he took on the younger heavy metal bands of the early 80s. So, I guess this quick hit is a little bit about Exciter in this album that we're covering today, but I do want to take a moment and just spotlight Johnny Z and what he did because, I just feel like if it wasn't for those risks that he took, I mean, the dude literally took a loan out just to put out Metallica's Kill 'Em All. And, again, where would we be? What music would we have if it wasn't for that risk that he took? Him and his wife took to sign a band like that who again, they were putting out music that I mean, this was stuff that nobody had ever heard of. This was stuff that nobody had ever really done, recorded, or anything yet up to this point. And I just you go look up the list of bands that Megaforce and Johnny Z did. Now, in all of my reading, somehow completely overlooked that he passed away a couple of years ago. So, unfortunately, that was a really great uh just a really great contributor to heavy metal as a whole. And like I said, I feel like a lot, all of our modern metal is really owes a great deal of credit to him and what he did for the music scene. I mean, I just think that it's pretty remarkable when you look at the list of bands that he signed and did their either their first album or their second album for, and then later on as he grew, he ended up getting on some bigger projects and things like that for bands. But I think by and large a lot of his really notable work is the really early stuff that he did, and I think that that's pretty incredible. So like I said, Exciter, their first album was titled Heavy Metal Maniac. The album that we're talking today, Violence and Force, is kind of a sequel to that album, according to the band. I read an interview in preparation for this where Dan Beehler talks about how they had put out Heavy Metal Maniac, and it just kind of got looked over. They didn't really tour on it. They just they had written it. They had played some songs live prior to writing and producing the album, but when they did finally produce the album, they pretty much put it out and then went right back to the studio to do Violence and Force. And so for him, in his mind, this is a true sequel to that first album. And for most Exciter fans, as you read, they sort of kind of, put the two albums together. They stack them side by side, and they feel that they're both critically important to the catalog for Exciter. So we're going to take another quick break, and I'll be back and we'll discuss a few more elements of the album. Today's episode is brought to you by the new single from my good friends in LOL. I've mentioned them before on the podcast. They are responsible for my opening song. Mr. Chris, that is doing vocals and keys for LOL.
He actually composed that song and gave that to me. So thank you so much, Chris. LOL has a new song out now. It's called Let's Not Split Hairs Here. You should definitely go check it out. These guys are based out of Minnesota and North Carolina. They've got that early 2000s emo vibe, and they really are just good dudes. So be sure to go check out the song. I'm going to play a little clip for you right now, and I hope you enjoy. Make sure to find that wherever you listen to music.
And we'll pretend you never make mistakes. Each time you tell me that I'm wrong, no matter how hard I try, it's not good enough. I put myself on the line. My heart is breaking inside, but I'll survive. I'm just fine.
Thanks again to LOL. That was Let's Not Split Hairs Here. Again, go find them wherever you listen to music and follow early 2000s emo vibe, fans of Stray Light Run, Taking Back Sunday, the Get Up Kids, any of those groups. So go check it out. LOL, spelled phonetically ELOWEL.
All right, welcome back. Let's jump into some details on the album and talk through a little bit of that. So, Violence and Force was released February 1984. Now, as I mentioned before, I listen to most things through Spotify. It's just the easiest and most convenient way for me to access most of this music. Spotify has this album listed as coming out in 1983, but all of the details that I could find really indicate that that was just when it was recorded, was late 1983, and it was actually officially released in 1984. So I'm not sure why Spotify puts 1983. It could just be a simple mistake. Maybe there's some information that I'm missing. Quite honestly, I had a really hard time looking up specifics about the album. You can go find details on the production and the studio, recording studio, and all of the personnel that were on the album. But as far as details behind the writing process and all of those kinds of things, or just any nuances to the actual album, it was really difficult to find anything. So I'm really going on minimal information here, but it features Dan Beehler on drums and vocals, John Ricci on guitar, and Alan Johnson on bass guitar. Now, this was recorded at Pyramid Studios in Ithaca, New York, which is upstate. That's where Johnny Z and his sort of Megaforce Records were all established. So at the time, I was reading that at the same time that Exciter was up there recording Violence and Force, that bands like Anthrax were hanging around and just kind of doing their thing. And so I, I just, I try to imagine what it would be like to just be in that. And I mean, that just seems like such a, I can't, there's not words really. It seems like such a unique period in time that all of these bands, all of this music that was so critical and is so crucial to the long-term success of heavy metal, and it's just all sitting and sort of festering in upstate New York, with Johnny Z and his record label, and it's just ready to explode. I mean, the thought of that is just mind blowing to me. But it was recorded up there. They recorded, and it was produced by Carl Kennedy. He was the drummer for the American heavy metal band The Rods. I've never heard of that band before. That was a new one to me. I'm at some point may have to go check those guys out. But they were apparently pretty prominent for bands like Exciter. I mean, when I read an interview from those guys about recording this album with Carl, they talked about how big of fans they were of the band The Rods, and so yeah, I just thought that was kind of interesting that they then, not only did they get the opportunity to record a second album, which was unlikely for a lot of bands in that time. The record label that they put out their first album on, Heavy Metal Maniac, they didn't even want Exciter back on the label. Now, I had also read that the guy who owned that record label that they put out their first album with was kind of a not a lot of great things to say about him. We'll put it that way. A lot of the band, even the guys from Exciter, they kind of shied away from specifics about it, but their main point was just, hey, look, like we were young, we didn't have money to hire a lawyer, and a lot of us signed kind of crappy record deals at that time, and It was just commonplace, and the music business just wasn't always artist friendly. I mean, it still isn't artist friendly. We've talked about it before, but especially back then, it just wasn't artist friendly. There weren't guys there to help them or guide them, and so to even get a second contract for any kind of record was a big deal. But then to also then get to do that with who they say was one of their big influences, I mean, that's got to be a really cool experience for them. We'll jump into some specifics on the actual sounds of the album and some of the songs. My initial thoughts are is that it reminds me a bit of the first Anthrax album. When you kind of compare the two, they came out relatively close together, and again, the amount of time that they spent together during the recording process, I find that interesting. Now, they say that they came into the studio fully prepared with all of their songs, and that was pretty common practice for them to make sure that they had everything that they needed to be able to write and record an entire album right there in the studio. So most of their songs were written and fleshed out. But ultimately, again, I think the sound similarity is really just the result of all of those groups, Metallica, Anthrax, Exciter, even Raven, just kind of all hanging out in the same area at the same time. And then I'm sure they were all just bouncing ideas off of each other, and that there was influential aspects to the music that came in and seeped in, and it was sort of a subconscious kind of a thing, I would imagine. But the overall tone and speed and vocal quality, again, it just reminded me a lot of Fistful of Metal. I listened to that album before this, so had I listened to this album before Fistful of Metal, I might be saying the opposite. The vocal technique of Dan Beehler is especially unique in that he has more of a shriek to his voice than other most other vocalists of the time. Now, granted, I haven't listened to every major contributor to power metal or to even speed thrash metal of this period, but so far from what I've listened to, Dan Beehler easily has one of the more unique vocals, in that time period. I mean, this is probably the closest that I've heard to a more extreme scream type vocal. He has sort of a shriek to his voice, than where most other vocalists were, focusing on more clean singing. You had exceptions, right? You had James Hetfield, who had a little more gruff to his voice, and it was a little bit different from the clean singing of especially early American metal or new wave British heavy metal. But then you had guys like Neil Turbin, who kind of dove into that a little screamier type vocal. But Beeler for sure kind of nosedives into that, and even has sections where he just goes into a full blown shriek, scream, sound, and so again, to me, this is easily one of the earliest introductions that I've had to any kind of extreme, you know, vocal for this period. Again, so much of it was focused on clean singing and that really high upper register tone and tonality. So uh, I thought that was something that was a lot more notable for Exciter than has been for some of the other bands that I've listened to through this period. Aside from that, I mean, this is easily the fastest album I've listened to. Aside from maybe Kill 'Em All, Kill 'Em All definitely has that more up tempo pace to it. And I think that that's why Metallica is widely considered some of the earliest forms of thrash that was out there. But and there have been albums from bands in the power metal era that featured a few songs that were more up tempo. Top one that comes to mind is "Fast as a Shark" by Accept. I mean, that song really has some speed, but Violence and Force has very few songs on it that slow down. I mean, they come out of the gate. It's a kind of an instrumental opening, real short openings track to it, and then the title track, "Violence and Force." It comes at you pounding fast, and they pretty much don't slow down for the whole rest of the album. I mean, there there are a few songs on it that are a little bit slower, but by and large, almost every song on the album is a lot faster paced than what most of the stuff that I've listened to, and I think that that's more unique than what some of the other bands were doing at the time. I mean, again, most other bands had a I don't want to say healthier mix because I think that depends on your description of healthy, but most of them had more of a mix of speed and sound and style. And Exciter, it's a pretty consistent sound and style throughout the album, with a few exceptions. I mean, I'd say the slowest songs on the album are Pounding Metal, Delivering to the Master, and War is Hell. I mean, that's 3 out of 10 tracks. So you're talking just over 30% of the album are slower. And even those songs are not slow by any means. Pounding metal is a more anthemic in its sound, and it's got sort of a chant along style chorus to it. The band's even said that they wrote that one to be more of a catchy kind of chorus when that audiences kind of sing along to, and is one that's still in the repertoire today. But then you got Delivering to the Master. It's got more of an older Black Sabbath style groove to it, and it lends more to just a darker tone of that track. And then War is Hell, it's the song that they close the album with, and it's also a little bit slower. Again, none of them are slow, but for as you compare it to the other 65% of the album, they're definitely on the slower side. Saxons of the Fire, to me, this is like a sped up Iron Maiden song. I mean, the vocal patterns remind me a lot of Bruce Dickinson and what he did. In the song structure as a whole, it feels very similar to something that Iron Maiden would have done if they were more of a thrash and speed metal band. I mean, even the theme, War and Land Conquering White Men, feels extremely Maiden esque. So you you hear the new wave of British heavy metal influence in this. I mean, again, this is this conglomeration of new wave of British heavy metal, early American metal, and punk rock all kind of crashing together, and that's where you get this sort of power metal sound from. The album closes with this song, War is Hell, which is about exactly what it sounds like. It's got a driving beat to the track, and they decided to close the album out with a song that's really more reminiscent of late 70s metal. I would say it's more akin to something that Judas Priest would write. It All in all, it's a pretty well rounded album. I think that, again, they really, I will also say this is a thought that's really just coming to me now. This is probably the tightest album that I've heard. And what I mean by that is in music and in music composition, or even just in if you're writing music as a band, tightness just refers to how well all of the sounds fit together and how polished it sounds even just playing it as a band, not all the stuff that you add in after to polish and clean things up like they do now, where they go through and they digitally edit so much of it that it's just pristine on the recorded track. This is tightness as a live band. So how close can you play this stuff to how it sounds on the album? And you can hear, to me, I can hear that they did come into the studio prepared. I can hear when they talk about, hey, we came in, we had all of our songs written, they were well rehearsed, we had played them a lot. They talk about how they were in their recording or their practice sessions 3 days a week before they even recorded this album, practicing all the songs. They talk about if one person messes up a part, they're all playing it, they're starting over and they're playing it again. So that shows in the album. You can hear the tightness. And again, in this period when it's analog and you're just laying down tracks live, you've got to hit those marks. You've got to hit those notes. This isn't a period where they could go in and they could clean up some stuff, but by and large, you're just hearing what the band would play, and that is really, really noticeable for this album. Again, a thought that's just occurring to me is just how noticeable and how clean and how tight the band sounds going through listening to this top to bottom. I mean, that I think to me is probably the most impressive part of this, because in all the other stuff that I've listened to, you can hear a little bit of looseness to it. You can hear that the band had really just written these songs and hadn't had much time to practice it, because the reality is as you go into the recording studio, Matt from Emory talked about this a bit ago, is by the time you go into a recording studio, you're writing songs in the studio. You're coming into the studio with maybe a few demo options, and you've got maybe a few songs worked out, but then you're writing a bunch of the other stuff and you haven't played it. You haven't played it as a band to kind of flesh out and hack out some of those parts that are a little trickier or maybe that don't feel quite right. And you've got a tight timeline to get something recorded so that it can hit production and it can get released. And I would say that is very much so still for this time period. Now, these guys played a lot more stuff live before they went and recorded things because of the nature of gigs and heavy metal being more underground at the time. But um, again, I just I yeah, I don't know why this thought's just occurring to me as I'm recording this, but it really shows itself how well practiced this band was in the recording of this album. So uh, it was a good listen. I'm really starting to feel how we got from where we started to where I am now with the stuff that I listen to on a daily basis. And that's really exciting for me. So go check it out. You can find that on the heavy metal, or sorry, I've recently retitled the name of the playlist to the Evolution podcast playlist. Uh, Crazy thought. Let's name it after the show that I do. So you could go find that on the Evolution podcast playlist. Exciter, Violence and Force, February 1984. Again, good listen. Go check it out and let me know what you think. Find me on socials, Facebook, TikTok. You can comment there. I'm doing an Emery album battle right now, where I'm kind of pitting the albums up against each other, and most reactions wins on Facebook. So that's been a lot of fun. So go check that out if you're a fan. And I'll be doing other bands. This seems to be going really successful, and people are enjoying the opportunity to kind of provide some commentary on the bands that they like. So I'll keep doing this, and we'll hit some of these older bands who have a much larger catalog, and we'll do it's kind of tournament style, right? So I'll do a couple albums against each other for one round, and then most reactions moves into the next round until we get to a final champion. Close out the Norman Jean one, and the album Wrongdoers was the winner. So it's top three for me. It's not my top album, but it's top three for me. But it's the votes of the people. So go find me on socials, check that stuff out. Would love to hear from you. Thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate all of your support. We will see you next time. I hope you have a great week.